Hello, hello. Welcome to another exciting episode of...
In the 11th century, Anselm of Canterbury attempted to propose a deductive, logical argument for the existence of God using rationality alone.
Part 3, Ontology.
God is the greatest maximal being, Anselm argued, therefore he exists. This came to be known as the ontological argument, and here's a video from William Lane Craig's YouTube channel attempting to explain it.
Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being.
Okay, and already we run into our first problem. In fact, I could have stopped at the word God, and we run into our first problem. I mentioned something like this briefly in my first episode in the series. Apologetic arguments fail on the face of them. They fail before they even get started, because you can grant them all. You can grant every apologetic argument that I can think of off the top of my head right now, and you will never get to the God of the Bible. You'll never get to Jesus. There's no way to get from apologetic argument to Christian God. I've been begging Christians for this for a long time. Where's the bridge? If I granted you your apologetic, make the bridge to Jesus. They can't do it. So at bottom, or at top, apologetic arguments are worthless because they get you nowhere. But there are reasons why apologetic arguments are worthless. So I'm going to define a dichotomy here that I hope is valid. I am not a philosopher, so the usual caveat there. But I know a little bit about theology. So what apologetic arguments do, and especially the ontological argument, is talk about God as a what as opposed to a who. So there's this what-who divide. Let's see, what can I coin for this? The identity dichotomy. Let's try that. All right, so all apologetic arguments fail at the who part. They never even try. They only deal with the what part, and this is compounded by the problem that Christians have when they talk about God. They have a what-who problem, this identity dichotomy. And so you always have to wonder what Christians are talking about when they say God. What is anyone talking about when they say Jew? Are they talking about the ethnicity? Are they talking about the citizens of a particular land? Are they talking about those who accept particular religious beliefs? Is it the religion? And so that same kind of thing exists with God. Are we talking about God as an abstraction, or some kind of entity with a certain ontology? Or are we talking about the person of God? We don't know. It's hard to keep up, and Christians conflate all of these things, so that when they say God, and if we get into a discussion about God, and we begin to explore the territory and argue a little bit, we might be talking past each other. At any given moment, the Christian might be talking about the who of God or the what of God. And it's confusing because even when they're talking about the who of God, they don't use God's names. Now, the first name God gave himself was Jealous. My name is Jealous. Okay. They don't call God Jealous, so they just say God. But let's get a little bit more serious with it. Christians tend not to say Yahweh. They don't say Yahweh. They say God. They don't say Jehovah. They say God. They don't say El. They say God. You even get that problem with in Lord, by the way, is another thing that they might say, but they don't call God by his personal name in conversation. And so are they talking about the who of God or the what of God? Well, it's all conflated in their mind, and even they don't know sometimes. The same thing happens when you're talking about Jesus. They say Jesus Christ, and some Christians just say Christ. Well, now what are you talking about? Christ is just another word for Messiah. Messiah has always in the Bible referred to a human. It does not refer to a God. It's an office. It's a role. Messiah is a role, like lieutenant, captain, general, king, maybe president. None of those words are necessarily proper nouns. They're roles. Okay, so if I don't say President Trump, if I just say the president, I haven't said anything special. We don't capitalize president. We don't capitalize king. We don't capitalize these roles except under very special circumstances. So there are rules for that kind of thing. And so when Christians talk about Christ, they're not even using a personal pronoun necessarily. I mean, they're not using a proper pronoun. They're just saying general, president, king, savior. They're referring to the rank, to the role of the rank even. And so they've got this formulation where they don't even have to talk about Jesus, just Christ. But if we change Christ to Messiah, I think fewer Christians would do that. If they just say Messiah, if they just say King, if they just say Anointed One, then their own language would sound funny to their own ear. But Christ has just become this religious term that doesn't mean anything to Christians. And so they use it as if it was the name of Jesus. It is not and has never been anybody's name in the Bible. It's not a name. So when they say Jesus Christ, they talk about it as if they're talking about David Johnson. Okay, Christ is not Jesus' last name. It's not a name. And so if you don't say Jesus, you haven't actually specified which Messiah you're talking about. Or if you're talking about any one in particular. If you just say God, you have not specified whether you're talking about Yahweh. And depending on your theology, you haven't distinguished whether you're talking about Yahweh or Jesus, because I guarantee you can make Christians draw a distinction between those two. And so the language gets lost already. What the ontological argument does is it tries to plant a flag in the what portion of the identity dichotomy and does nothing for the who. So let's apply that to what we just heard.
Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God.
Okay. And so I'm going to rip up the ontological argument pretty quickly and easily. And this video is fairly short, but I just want to make, lay the groundwork for the case. Defining God is part of the problem. If what Christians mean by God is the who, that you should have a personal relationship with, you can't get to the who from the what. You simply can't. Let me give you an exercise. David Johnson, that would be me. By the way, if you're new to the show, I'm David Johnson. How you doing? Try defining David Johnson. Just try it. Let's see if you can come up with any definition of David Johnson that gets you to me. You can't do it because I'm primarily not a what, I'm a who. But let's try. Let's see what we do here. When I say define, you still can't do it. So what it amounts to is a series of descriptions that we hope leads to some kind of ontology. And to be clear again, I'm not entirely sure that an ontology is a proper category of thing. What is an ontology? I've heard some Christians define it when they have been pushed to define it as the nature of a thing. And so I talk about it that way. But be very careful. Remember what I said about language. There's a very good chance that they're using language very differently than you. When we talk about nature, we're talking about the actual reality in the universe. When the Christians talk about nature, they're usually talking about something metaphysical. Okay, the essence of a thing. Now we're already into the weeds. What do you mean by the nature of something? What do you mean by the essence of something? So define or describe my essence. And now we get lost. But let's keep going. David Johnson is a Homo sapien. Okay? Did you define David Johnson? Did you get to me with that description? You haven't even started. You haven't even started. In fact, we started arbitrarily at Homo sapien. We could have said David Johnson is a living being. So is every blade of grass, dude. So yeah, I have life. How are you defining that? Okay, but and David Johnson is an animal being. Okay, great. We'll remove flora and fauna. Have we defined David Johnson? We haven't even gotten started. Okay, so David Johnson is a hominid, an upright hominid. So David Johnson is a Homo sapien. Now we're getting somewhere. But not really. How many Homo sapiens are there in the universe ever? Even if we're just restricted to this planet, not assume that there might be some on other planets. Okay, have we defined David Johnson? We haven't even gotten started. David Johnson is going to live within a lifespan no more than 120 years. So whatever the date is right now that you're listening to this, just regress the date 100 years back from now and 100 years forward from now. And you'll be pretty well within your rights to say that is the time span that we're defining David Johnson in. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. We've narrowed it down to billions. Okay, so David Johnson is a Homo sapien. What are some of the other things that we can describe David Johnson as? The reason for this exercise is to show you that no matter how many descriptions you layer on top of it, you haven't come close to beginning to define David Johnson into existence. You can't define me that way. You can know me. You can't define me. And so, and the thing is, we know a lot about humans. We know a great deal about humans. We've studied them for a long time. We are them. So if you could define a person, then we would have been able to do it. But we can't, despite what we know about persons. You're never going to come up with a definition that gets you to David Johnson. Yet that's kind of what Christians do with ontology, and that's part of the what-who dichotomy is all about. When you start talking about God as a what, there is a natural barrier that keeps you from getting to who. Now, if you start talking about God as who, maybe you can get to a what, I'm not sure. But you can never go from a what to a who. So if you're talking about the ontological argument, it's all about the what. And the reason there is no bridge between the what and the who is because there can never be a bridge. So what is a God? The ontological argument, I think, maybe leans somewhere in that direction. I've asked Christians this many times. Not what is your God? What is a God, period? God as a category. What is God as an ontology? So that if we saw some other being, we could compare that being to the ontology that you described as God and know whether that other being is a God or not. So what is a God? Christians cannot tell you that. People who believe the ontological argument is a good idea cannot give you a single hint at the ontology of God. They can't do it. And so they are left to just make descriptions and hope to build a picture that ends up becoming an ontology of some kind. Trust me, there's a point here. So then they lean on the descriptions. God is, we'll just keep it simple for the moment, the maximally great being. Okay. Well, that's a description. But we have a problem, again, another problem, a big problem that kind of torpedoes the idea of the ontological argument being a good idea, which is this narrator has said that if there was a being even greater, then that being would be God. Do you see the problem? And this is the problem with all descriptions that try to lead to a who. If being maximally great means you are God, then the one you're thinking of as God right now gets tossed aside for someone else who's maximally greater. If someone else came along and was greater than the being that you think of as God, then you would have to say, theologically, philosophically anyway, with the ontological argument, okay, well, that's not God anymore over there. Then this new thing is God. You cannot be comfortable with defining God that way as just a simple set of characteristics. In that way, if we try to define a real person this way, then it would lead to the absurdity that the person themselves could at some point decide that they don't exist. So here's how that looks. If you define David Johnson as the smartest person in the room, which I have been on some occasions in my life, small rooms. If you define David Johnson as the smartest person in the room, as if to say the smartest person in the room is ontologically David Johnson, and then someone else walks into the room who's smarter than David Johnson, then you would say that that person is David Johnson, and then I'm not. Why? Because David Johnsonness is tied to being the smartest person in the room. It has nothing to do with me personally. You're just describing some ontological characteristic. And the moment someone, and it's an exclusive characteristic, and so the moment someone else has that characteristic, then I would have to say, well, I'm no longer David Johnson, because I'm not the smartest guy in the room anymore. That's what you run into when you try to define God this way. And it's very easy to talk past each other, because a Christian has their set of ideas of what makes a being maximally great. So they're saying whatever that being is that I have defined, that is God. But I can come along and say, well, I dispute your, at least one of your descriptions of maximal greatness. I think that there is another characteristic that would be even greater. So in my mind, the maximally greatest being would have these characteristics. And so my God then would exist and be just as valid as your God. Because to me, I have come up with the maximally greatest being, and it's different from your maximally greatest being. So in some real sense, either your God cannot exist if my maximally greatest being is actually greater, or we just have two maximally great beings, and therefore we have a pantheon. You will always run into this problem with the ontological argument, and there is really no workaround to get you out of it. The ontological argument is probably one of the most redefined arguments of apologetics, because it's so bad. And I'm not brilliant when I come up with objections. I'm absolutely certain that every objection I come up with happened hundreds of years ago. Okay, so, but that I think is fundamentally one of the biggest problems. We'll come into another one though here pretty soon. So let's move forward.
And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world.
Okay. Well, we got there faster than I anticipated. This is not the maximally greatest being. This being, because it really depends on how you understand greatness. It depends on your, another fancy word that I don't like to use, but I think it fits here. It depends on your deontology. It depends on your values and your value system as to what you define as great making. If we talk about a capitalistic society like America, the maximally greatest being might be the richest person in the world. All right, one who accumulates all the wealth. But does any Christian believe that that defines greatness at all? Is that a part of any Christian's value? The accumulation of wealth? It's part of some people's value. So, what makes their value worse than your value? You don't consider the accumulation of wealth valuable. They do consider the accumulation of wealth valuable. So you can never agree on what the maximally great being is. So this is part of the problem with the ontology. In fact, maybe they should call it the deontological argument. So we start with power. Well, what do we say about power, even in our corrupted society? We still believe that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I can explore that thought further if you like, but there's no need, and we've taken enough time already, so I want to move quickly. Let's just take that as read. What we're saying is there is a framework that even Christians recognize that would suggest that the accumulation of power is not a good thing. What we might say, if we want to improve it, is that whatever power you have, to be a maximally great being, you would have to use the power you have for the maximum good. Whatever that is. Even if you have only very little power, if you use it to maximum good, then great, you would still qualify. But simply to say that if you got all the power, therefore you're maximally great, who would agree with that? And then if you throw morality in with that, then what you come up with is a system of might makes right. We're not talking about any kind of maximally greatness that I would recognize. But this is exactly the kind of maximal greatness that this description leads you to. It is the inevitable conclusion of this description. But I want to go a little bit deeper with some of these maximal qualities. So like all power, I would say that that is incoherent. I will stop just short of saying contradictory. I just say it's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything to have all the power. The only way to have all the power in any system is for you to be the only thing in the system. Right? If there is any other power flowing through the system, then you don't have all power. If there's God and David Johnson, God doesn't have all power because David Johnson has some power. If David Johnson has the ability to make choices that actually stick, then God doesn't have all the power. I've got some power to make choices. So what does all power even mean when you've got a universe full of all kinds of natural power that you say is not God? You can say God created it all you want to, but he just created another source of power that means that he's not all power anymore. He gave some of his power away. It's not his anymore. You can say he can hit the off button if he wants to. Great. Then he would be the only one in the universe, and then he would have all power. But as long as the on switch is activated, he doesn't have all power because the universe exists. And within the universe, if you're just talking about human type power, well, we've got about 8 billion powered people. That's 8 billion times iterating the point that God doesn't have all power, because he gave it away to at least 8 billion people. Now they have power. So those people have more power than I do and exert that power over me. I have more power than some other people do and exert that. Hopefully benevolently and correctly, but there's all kinds of power in the universe that is not God. Because then we're just talking about some form of pandeism. Everything is God. And so if everything is God, then we are literally just non-player characters in God's body, in God's mind. Which would be a problem, I think, for some of the other things. And so the idea that God has all power, if there is another being in the room that has power, then I would say it's maybe contradictory, but I think it's safer to just say it's pure incoherent nonsense. So that can't be maximally great. It's not maximally great deontologically for most people, including Christians, because amassing a bunch of power is something we consider a corrupting factor. So what else? All-knowing. Well, if we look at the God character in the Bible, he's a God that doesn't seem to know things. Alex is going to cover this all-knowing part, and so I'm going to back off of it a little bit. I will say, though, that if God is all-knowing, he knows everything that has happened, everything that is happening now, and everything that's going to happen, then everything that does happen, the consequences of that is on him. It's not on us. I might do something that you consider sin, but I don't know what the consequences are going to be. I have limited knowledge. Therefore, I can only be limitedly culpable. Flipping that button destroyed the universe? I didn't know that. Somebody should have put tape over it. You have to consider that even if God says don't flip that button, what do I know? It's like saying don't eat the last cookie before you go to bed. Screw you. I'm going to eat the last cookie. If it disturbs my sleep a little bit, worth it. If the cookie contained poison that kills humans instantly, that's not on me that I killed myself. It's on you because you withheld some knowledge. Now, if you created the universe and you created me knowing that I would flip the switch, and let's just say flipping the switch is my own libertarian choice. Cool. But you made me knowing that I would make that choice. Then the rest of the people in the universe would have to say, hey, God, why didn't you stop him? Because you intervened to stop people from doing things all the time. You might even go a step further and say, why did you create him? Since you knew he was going to flip the switch. What did you do that for? And so in that way, the universe being destroyed by the flipping of the switch is God's fault. It is his responsibility because of his all-knowingness. And yet, somehow, all of the culpability goes to the creatures that are not all-knowing. Would I call this contradictory? No, but I would call it incoherent nonsense. Morally perfect. Again, I'm going to have to throw out incoherent nonsense. Possibly contradictory. This is the least definable characteristic you can give anybody because Christians will not try to define morality. But what do you mean by morality, Christian? They will not tell you. They will just talk about killing babies for fun. And their brain is already short-circuited. And no matter what conversation you have after that is going to be non-productive. Because you cannot even get a basic definition of what morality is. And I will tell you further, even they don't know. It's like spiritual. They have no idea. They just know it's important. You can't be a Christian without it. But spiritual, what is it? Shut up. That's what it is. Morality, what is it? Shut up. That's all morality will ever be, is incoherent nonsense. But we can play that out further as well. What is perfect? Well, I don't know what perfect is, but I do know, at least in the theological world of the Christian, none of us can know what it is. None of us can know what moral perfection, what the morally perfect thing in any given situation is. Even in simple situations where we might use our intuition and say, yeah, the morally correct thing to do in this situation would be this, but you don't know because you're not all knowing. The morally correct thing is to save that baby from drowning. But what you don't know is that God threw that baby in the water in the first place, and whether you jump in or not, that baby gonna drown. God's gonna drown him. He will reach down his God hand and push that baby underwater until he dead. And you have to call that morally perfect, because you have to say, well, I don't know what moral perfection is, but God had some extra knowledge that makes his actions morally perfect. So we just have to throw up our hands when it comes to moral perfection. And that means that moral perfection is nothing more than an abstraction. It is a thing you invent in your head and try to picture in your head, but you cannot actually actualize in real life. And you just say this abstract thing, and then you say God. Whatever moral perfection is, I don't know it, I can't see it, God will tell me when I get to heaven, but whatever he does is morally perfect. This is not even a definition. It's not a description. It's an undefined description. Nobody knows what it is. When telling soldiers to run your sword through the big round spot in the pregnant woman's belly, we don't know what moral perfection is at that point. When a God tells soldiers, kill both infants and sucklings, which is to say, little bitty kids and nursing babies, target them specifically. And when the war is over, I mean, this is a natural entailment of that. When you're done slaughtering everybody, look around and make sure that no parent hid their babies, like people would do. Make sure that there's no babies in the rubble of that basement that are still alive. Kill them all. Kill them. You see a baby literally nursing? Kill the mother, and then pick up the baby and slam his head against concrete, make sure he's dead. That's the order. That's the literal order. And when that is the order, we just have to throw up our hands when it comes to morality, especially moral perfection, because no human who's sane, who lives in this particular time period, would come up with that as the answer to what is the morally perfect thing to do in this situation. Not one of us. Not even crazy Christians. They wouldn't come up with that answer at all. But God came up with the answer. And so all we can do is throw up our hands and say, yeah, it's whatever God says or is or whatever. I don't know what it is. Shut up. Moral perfection. But we can explore that even more, because I do think that it leads to all kinds of contradictions. I think any of these attributes, if you explore them out far enough, is going to lead to not just an absurdity, but a contradiction. So just one example. I'll take the most famous example because it still reigns as undefeated. So boring, but still good. The Nazis come to your door and they're looking for Jews. You've got some Jews hiding under the floorboard, a mother and nursing baby. They're being very quiet, and the officer asks, are there any Jews in this house? Now, you want to do the morally perfect thing. And you know, because it's been defined specifically, that all liars will have their part in the lake of fire. All of them. And that God hates, one of the things that God really hates, despises, can't stand to be around, is lies. Let's just forget about all the examples where that's not the case. It explicitly says these things. So let's just assume that we just don't understand all the other stuff that the Bible says that seems to contradict it. All right, so now you've got a problem. Is the morally perfect thing to say, yes, I am harboring Jews in my basement. There is a mother and a nursing child. And by the way, I also have a Jewish heritage, even though I am German. My great-great-great-great-grandmother was a Jew. Let's just be completely honest about all of it. Is that what you do? Is that the morally perfect thing to do? Or is the morally perfect thing to lie your ass off and say, yeah, look, there were some Jews. There's this mother nursing baby. They came to the door and I slammed it in their face. And they went that way. Right? I think I would try that one. That would be me. But then I would be a liar and I would have my part in the lake that burns in fire and brimstone. And God really hates all that lying. But this is one of those cases where I think most people, even Christians, even crazy Christians, would say that the morally perfect thing to do would be to lie, which is one of the most morally imperfect things that you can do. It leads to all kinds of absurdities like that. And so what this argument has done is it's given us 3 characteristics that are absolutely anti-maximally great.
So the first problem that we run into is that these properties are contradictory and paradoxical. Okay, firstly, we have omnipotence. Nothing can truly be all-powerful. This is a common philosophical thought, and you've probably heard it best exemplified in the famous dilemma. Could God create a rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it? Now, this dilemma is usually brought up when discussing the nature of God's omnipotence on the presumption that he actually exists. And the best solution to this problem to most people would seem to be that maybe God is a maximally powerful being, but not all-powerful. And if you're not familiar with the dilemma, the 2 possible answers are either...
Okay, before I let him go on with the dilemmas, I'm just going to jump in right quick with the maximal... Hang on. I'm getting my language mixed up here.
The best solution to this problem to most people would seem to be that maybe God is a maximally powerful being, but not all-powerful. And if...
Right, okay. So, the difference between maximal and omni, right? This is where the first place, I think, where Christians try to retreat. One of the fatal arguments with the ontological argument that was, obvious to everyone except Anselm. So we quickly get these kinds of fixes, but it's a fix that doesn't work. Because once you go to maximally as opposed to omni, you've simply gotten away from a God concept that Christians recognize, right? So you could say there's a God, the real God has the maximal qualities, but not the omni qualities. Good luck trying to get a Christian to admit that God has no omni qualities. They would say, well, that's not God then. So this is something that only ivory tower academics can even pretend to engage in. You're not going to get anyone in the pews, even anyone in the pulpits, really saying that. But let's go with maximally and see if that solves the problem. So what the difference between maximal and omni is like saying, well, I am the smartest, I have all knowledge. I'm the smartest person with unlimited or all possible knowledge versus saying I'm maximally knowledgeable, which is to say I have all of the knowledge that can be had. But you see, we can actually water it down even more than that by saying, well, I have maximal knowledge, which is to say I have all of the knowledge that I can have. Do you see the difference between the two maximals? One is I have all of the knowledge in the world that can be had. So, for instance, let's say the principle of uncertainty, the uncertainty principle. Let's say we can't have knowledge of exactly, the spin or location of a particle because of uncertainty. So I can't know that, but I can know how many particles there are. Nothing that would keep you from knowing that. Let's just ignore everything we know about physics. I'm just trying to give you an example here. So that would be one type of maximal versus all. But the other type of maximal would be, well, I know about all of the particles that I learned in school and that I could read about in books and learn about in videos. Well, that doesn't mean I know about all of the particles that could exist. I know about a handful. And a God might know about all of the particles that could exist, or maybe he just knows about all of the particles that existed when he created, but didn't keep up when new particles were formed. So there's so many ways to cut maximal that it's easy to, again, be talking past one another, and you end up with a point where there is no God that's worth talking about, or you end up at a point where I'm God, because I have the maximal knowledge of the things that I know. So if you take that set of things that I know, I know the maximum amount of it. It's not a useful framing. What would be maximal when you're saying morally perfect? Well, you could say, well, I'm as morally perfect as I can be given my circumstances. Okay, that doesn't mean that everything I do is moral. Maybe some circumstances, present natural dilemmas, and so it's going to lead to some kind of contradiction. So I've got to do something immoral here. But that's my circumstance. So I'm maximally moral given my circumstances, and part of my circumstances is my brain chemistry. And my emotional setup. And so things that I think are okay, maybe some of them aren't, but that's, my circumstance won't allow me to do anything else. So I am maximally moral given my circumstance. I'm God. I have moral perfection given a maximal amount of it. You see, maximal is one of those poison pills that can just rip up any notion of God. I am very sure that there were times when Adolf Hitler was the most moral person in the room, considering the people he surrounded himself with. I'm absolutely positive of that. So what we say that Hitler is morally perfect in a maximal kind of way. It's ridiculous. Sometimes people will use maximal as in just the highest level achieved. So, for instance, somebody in the world has the highest IQ. That doesn't mean they're all-knowing. That doesn't mean that they know even all of the things that can be known, but they know more than anybody else. All right, that's the being that has maximal knowledge. In that definition, it means nothing. So you could say that God has more power than me. Not all power, but he's got more than me. He's got a maximal knowledge in that he has more knowledge than me. He doesn't know what the future is, but that's not a part of the knowledge that can be had, and so it's maximal knowledge. He's morally perfect compared to me. He does fewer wrong things than me. You could say that. I don't think you can, actually. You're still not doing anything to describe a who. and you've watered down God so much that you've made it even harder to identify what you mean by a God. Because let's say if your God can be killed, and the Christian God can be, because he was, some other person at that time would then be maximally great. Because if your maximal greatness, you have, candidate number 1, candidate number 2, candidate number 3, and you knock off number 1, then the one who was number 2 is now God. Because he's now maximally great. So maximal is a poison pill that Christians should not try to use as a retreat. But they do, and that's one more reason why the ontological argument is the worst argument ever, because the attempts to save it make it worse.
If you're not familiar with the dilemma, the two possible answers are either A, that God can create the rock so heavy that he can't lift it, but if he can't lift it, he's not omnipotent, and B, that he can't make the rock, which means he's also not omnipotent. And the same thing goes for omniscience, being all-knowing, that is, if you couple it with omnipotence, because we come across another thing that God cannot do. If God is truly omniscient, then that means that he can see the future. He knows every single intervention he will ever make, and he knows of every single choice that he will ever make in advance. But it then logically follows that God cannot change his mind. If God was able to change his mind, then that means that he can't have been able to foresee whatever the factor was that caused him to change his mind, because if he could have foreseen it, then he wouldn't have been changing his mind at all. But if he couldn't foresee the factors that would cause him to change his mind, then he's not omniscient. As for imagining a morally...
Okay, and just to add here for the audio listeners, I think there was a passage put on scripture, but within the Bible, if we're talking about the Bible God, that's a who, not a what. The Bible God changes his mind all the damn time. In fact, there are passages that literally say, and God changed his mind. So you can talk about the passages that say God is not human so that he can change his mind. And then a few pages over and God changed his mind. Okay, so you can look at the description or as of the what, or you can look at the actions of the who. It is extremely contradictory. And so the all knowledge part becomes even more absurd when you add the specific who that the Christian is talking about, because the book that they learn about the who describes God as changing his mind, therefore would necessitate that he's not all-knowing. It also talks about, has other descriptions that suggest that he's not all-knowing. And so I'm trying not to bring those in when talking about the argument, but when you know who the Christian is talking about, they're not going to tell you. When you know that, you recognize that this is not some philosopher's God. The God of the Bible is not the philosopher's God.
Perfect being. This is contingent upon already having some pre-existing idea of objective morality before we've gotten to the stage of proving God. Now don't get me wrong here, if God did exist, then there would be an objective moral standard. But you can't say, imagine an objectively perfect morality in order to prove God, if you need that God in order to prove the existence of the objective morality. You can't appeal to the objective morality of God as a stepping stone to proving that God. These factors are contradictory or wrong. There cannot exist a being that is fully omnipotent and fully omniscient. It just leads to too many paradoxes. Now, incidentally, I'm actually using the exact same logic that William Lane Craig himself uses a lot of the time when he's talking about infinity. You may have seen him do this when talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, the idea of an infinite regress. There can't be an infinitely existing universe. It must have had a beginning. And the reason that he gives for this is because if you think of infinity as a calculable number, it leads to paradoxes. For instance, you can't take infinity and add infinity. You still get infinity, and this is just mathematically impossible and leads to a whole number of contradictions.
If the universe never began to exist, then the number of past events is infinite. But, Al-Ghazali argued, this is impossible because an actually infinite number of things cannot exist. The way in which Ghazali shows the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences from it.
Therefore, applying it to something like the age of the universe, the entire concept is absolutely null. I'm using the exact same logic.
Okay. I just wanted to add something to this logic because I've just always found it, well, let's just say confusing, maybe a little nonsensical, because in the Christian framework, God is infinite. So the universe is not infinite. So God was before the universe, which means there was a time when the universe didn't exist. An infinite amount of time before the universe existed, because God is infinite, past infinite. So by their same reasoning, we should never have a universe, because you could never get to the point where a universe existed. Okay? So, and yet we have a universe. And so if they accept that with an infinite, then they should not have the problem of infinite regress without a God. It would be exactly the same thing, philosophically speaking. We would get to this point in the exact same way that we get to this point with a God who existed before the universe infinitely. Infinite future, we think that's a little bit more intuitive. It really isn't. It's just harder to see. So if we take that same example, let's say Christians in heaven, and there are, two activities. There is singing praises to God, and then there's looking at the golden castle, where God lives, in taking a tour around the outside of the castle. So we've got this itinerary, and we're doing one of the things in the itinerary. However, there's a problem. Heaven is eternal. There's no getting to the end of time in heaven. So the moments between you singing around the throne and touring the castle are infinite, and so you would never get to the next part of the itinerary. It would never happen. So this is how the reasoning boomerangs back on them. I don't have to show why that's a bad argument against infinite regress. All I have to do is show that for the Christian, they have all of the same problems if they imagine God and themselves in heaven. That never goes away. And just changing frames from on earth to in heaven doesn't fix the problem. It just helps them not think about the problem anymore.
The paradoxes of infinity mean that infinite things cannot exist. Then the paradoxes of omnipotence and omniscience means that an omnipotent, omniscient being can't exist either.
Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have.
Why does it seem possible that unicorns could exist? It's a serious question. And I think the only true and honest answer is it seems possible because you don't know shit about things existing. You don't know shit about science. You don't know shit about unicorns. So to you, anything's possible. Anything that you don't know, that's a space of possibilities. In the universe of ignorance, anything is possible. But once you know one thing in that universe, then there's at least one thing, the violation of that one thing, there's at least one thing that's not possible. In the world of Christians, anything and everything is possible. And that is a sad indictment on what they know and don't know. But that's all that is. It's just an indictment against the person who says anything is possible. That means you don't know a single thing for sure, or with reasonable confidence. So again, why is a unicorn possible? Well, you can't even define a unicorn. It's not just a horse with a horn on it. It's a magical horse with a horn on it. So what does it take to get a magical horse? The answer is you don't know. You have no idea. It's a universe of ignorance for you, and so must be possible. There may be simply no way for a unicorn to exist. Imagine how big our universe is right now. And if you accept that unicorns probably can't exist in this universe, despite how big and diverse this universe is. If unicorns probably can't exist in this universe, there's probably a pretty good reason for that. And the reason might carry across all universes. It just may not be possible for such a thing to exist. And so my advice, quit treating your ignorance as a possible universe. It's just a universe of ignorance. Do not tell me what is possible on the basis of what you don't know. So any argument that relies on possible worlds, I've gone rounds with this one, with Dale and others. The problem with the possible worlds, you don't know what's possible in any given world. You don't even know what's possible in this world. Val and I have had go-rounds with this. Val argues it better. I can't necessarily win against Val, but I still think I'm right. I'm wearing a gray shirt right now. I could have worn a black shirt, or could I? Is there a possible world where I could have picked up the black shirt instead of the gray shirt? The fact is, we don't know, even I don't know, all of the things that went into my picking up the gray shirt instead of the black shirt. Intuitively, it seems like I could have picked up the black shirt. But I would say that in this universe, it was impossible for me to pick up the black shirt because I didn't. So we can look back and say, well, I guess that wasn't possible at that moment in time with my configuration of brain, with the way my shirt drawers are organized, any of that stuff. It would have simply been impossible. We do not know that there is a configuration of any possible world where I could have picked up the black shirt. So let's be careful not to fill our universe of ignorance with possibilities.
So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist.
My point exactly. You can imagine all you like things that may exist in possible universes, from unicorns to leprechauns to Christopher Hitchens losing a debate, as long as these things are not logically incoherent. An omnipotent, omniscient God is logically incoherent. In the same way that you can dismiss a married bachelor in any possible universes, I can also dismiss the God that you're presenting.
So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world.
What you're doing here is you're assuming that existence is a perfection. But this is a subjective analysis. We might subjectively agree that existence is better than non-existence, but we can't prove that existence adds intrinsic objective value to a concept.
Correct. So let's imagine a world where Hitler is a character, a fictional character in a book, but not actualized in reality, in a world where Hitler is a real person, actualized. In this case, which is the greater characteristic, existence or non-existence?
This is what Immanuel Kant said in his Critique of Pure Reason, that existence is not a predicate.
Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists.
No, just the God that you're presenting. You can conceive of a maximally but not all-powerful God. You can conceive of a God which is not omniscient, which doesn't know fully what's going on. In fact, this could account for the problem of evil. But the God that you're presenting is logically incoherent, and so yes, we can say that it's impossible to even imagine such a being.
Right. And when you throw in that maximal in there, as Alex just did, then I might be God.
Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial.
Which is exactly why I'm going to try to rebut them. Look at premises 2. A maximally great being exists in some possible world. But by the logic that you've just presented, this simply can't be the case. You just said so yourself, that for a maximally great being to be truly maximally great, it must exist in all possible worlds. So if it only exists in some possible worlds, then it's not maximally great. So whatever this being is that exists in some possible world, it's by your own definition not maximally great.
So I'm just going to say, I think Alex was brilliant. I think he was brilliant back then, whenever this video was done. I think that's a clunker of an objection, because we're just making a linguistic gotcha kind of argument here, as I see it. To say he exists in some possible world is perfectly coherent, even if you're talking about a God that exists in all possible worlds. This is just a linguistic argument that I think is not very well formed. The real objection that Alex should be making here is the use of possible worlds as an argument at all.
How could you possibly say that a maximally great being can exist in some possible worlds if to be maximally great, it must exist in all possible worlds? This is, once again, say it with me kids, logically incoherent. Now this video goes on to present a possible response to the ontological argument, and it may be a response that you're thinking of right now, but it's not a very good one. If you want to see the way that they put it, it's in the description down below, but I'll try to summarize it here. At the time that Anselm was writing in the 11th century, he had a contemporary called Gunillo, or Guanillo, or however you want to pronounce it. Now, Gunillo was a believer, but he didn't agree with the ontological argument. It didn't sit right with him, and his response to the argument was as follows. He said, well look, I can imagine the most perfect possible island, but that doesn't mean that that island exists. And this may be a sort of gut reaction response. You're saying, well, just because you can imagine the most perfect God doesn't mean that that most perfect God actually exists. But the ontological argument, it's worth remembering, isn't trying to prove the most perfect, the maximally great God. It's trying to prove the maximally great being. Okay, there's no more perfect island than the most perfect island. By definition, there's no more perfect pizza than the most perfect pizza. But there is a more perfect thing than both of these. And that most perfect thing, the most perfect thing of all, according to Anselm's logic, is God. And so you shouldn't use this argument, even though it instinctively seems to fit. But fear not, because the fallacy with this argument doesn't lie in the relation between the premises and the conclusion, but in the premises themselves. So let's lay out this argument in some no-nonsense premises. Premise 1. God has all perfections. Premise 2. Necessary existence, that is, existing, is a perfection. Premise 3. If God has necessary existence, then God exists. Therefore, God exists. Now, we've already discussed that premise 1 and premise 2 are probably faulty, but let's pretend that they're not. What we're saying here is God has all perfections, necessary existence is a perfection, so God has necessary existence, God exists. But the problem lies in the very first word of the very first premise. God. God has all perfections. We're assuming that God exists because for God to have something, this God must exist. So we need to make a very subtle change to the first premise. And that is this. We need to say, instead of saying God has all perfections, we should be saying, if God exists, then God has all perfections. And it seems like a subtle change, but it's really not. So now we're saying, if God exists, then he has all perfections. And necessary existence is one of those perfections. So we're saying, if God exists, God has necessary existence. If God exists, then he exists. What about the second premise? So we've merged the first two premises into one premise. So the second premise becomes what the third premise used to be. That is, if God has necessary existence, then God exists. If God exists, then God exists. And then we have our conclusion. So let's put all these together. We have premise 1. If God exists, then God exists. Premise 2. If God exists, then God exists. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. I don't know about you, but this suddenly doesn't seem like such an appealing argument. But even putting all of that aside, this argument relies on the ability to firstly imagine an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being. The first two, as we've already shown, are logically incoherent, and the third relies on God to give you the objective morality in order to prove God. Okay, this simply doesn't work. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most famous and well-respected religious theologians of all time, rejected this argument. Okay, know that if you're watching this and you are religious, you can believe in God without believing in this argument. Okay, you can sympathize with its conclusion, but you don't need to be an atheist to realize that this specific argument isn't even worth the time that it would take to discuss in a formal debate. But anyway, I'm sorry. I know it's been a while since I've uploaded.
All right, and that is, for all intents and purposes, the end of this video. I was trying to think of ways of describing what the what who problem, the identity dichotomy that I came up with, and I was hesitant to give this example, but since the video is over and you've listened this far, I'll try it out. So the what is the cookie jar, and the who is the star-shaped snickerdoodle cookie. So if you described the cookie jar, you can do, and by the way, God is the cookie. So you can describe the cookie jar to the small, excuse me, to the smallest detail. You just define the cookie jar into existence. Great. You've covered its every attribute. You have said nothing about the cookie inside of the cookie jar. You haven't even proven that there's a cookie inside the cookie jar. You just defined this thing that you call a cookie jar. So you've defined a what. Christians haven't done this well, but let's just assume that their apologetics work and they define what a God is. They still haven't defined the God. Describing the cookie jar doesn't tell you anything about the cookie, whether there is a cookie, whether that cookie is in the cookie jar, what kind of cookie it is, what shape that cookie it is, how the cookie wants to be eaten. There's no thing that you can do with the ontology of the jar that will get you to the cookie. The ontology will not tell you how the cookie tastes. The ontology will not give you a relationship with the cookie. You haven't even begun the process of dealing with the cookie. And so, as Alex says, arguing against everything that's wrong with the ontological argument will take way more time, than the argument is worth. It's a ridiculous thing, but I wanted you first and foremost to understand why, even if you granted everything in the ontological argument, you don't get to God. You don't get close to God. You haven't made the first step toward getting to or understanding Yahweh. Or is it El? Or is it Jesus? You haven't come one step closer to a relationship. And like I said, there's no way to form a bridge. There's no bridge. There's no bridge from the cookie jar to the cookie inside of it. So there you go. I am really surprised that I got this much mileage out of the ontological argument, because my write-up was very dismissive. But I'm doing the best I can, folks. As part of the reason this takes a while is, what would be the best steel manning of these arguments, and then let me argue against the best version of that argument. And these arguments don't have a best version. They're pretty bad. And so the worst argument, the worst apologetic argument ever, it's obviously the ontological argument, until the argument that we get to the next time. And that's just me. What about you? skepticsandseekers.squarespace.com. Log in your Discuss account, discuss ways, send me an email, skepticsandseekers@gmail.com. Till next time, I will see you in the comments. In the meantime, why does this always sneak up on
New tab.
me?
Share.
Oops, now my computer's talking to me. And I refuse. I absolutely refuse to edit the end of this. I'm going to figure this out one day. Until next time, I'm